Urban Tech Hub will be your guides on an exploration of what's possible as AI spills out into the streets of cities over the next decade. What will these new technologies make possible? And how will the encounter of AI with the city change the technologies themselves? Our map for this journey is the future of urban tech, a 10-year horizon scan that we published at Cornell Tech's Urban Tech Hub last year. And it's really an interactive graph of about 200 different pieces of content, everything from signals, which we think of as examples of the future that are here today, to trends, which aggregate some of those signals to indicate directions of change, to forecasts, which really synthesize all of these trends and try to paint a picture of where we're headed over the next decade. And as we were planning this, I struggled with where to begin. These are the 6 top-level forecasts from the Horizon Scan, and they highlight all different directions and possibilities, from the integration of bioengineering and life science into urban planning and infrastructure, to the role of industry in shaping future cities, to climate change and resilience. But where I really zeroed in on was this forecast around the new Green Deal. This is actually a name that I stole from Naomi Klein in a book that she wrote a few years ago, an article she wrote a few years ago that was really criticizing the way that technology was surging in the beginning of the pandemic and displacing public services like healthcare and education. That was a very critical point of view. And there certainly has been a lot of critique and backlash around AI and the way it's been developed and built out over the last decade. The many biases that are embedded in these systems, the brittleness when they move and try to do things beyond their area of expertise. But this forecast is also very much about building, rebuilding, or even rebooting AI, to use the title of a recent book by Ernest Davis and Gary Marcus. And this headline forecast, Inclusive Innovation Strikes Back at Surveillance Capitalism, really speaks to that agenda, recognizing what's wrong, but also working to fix it. And just as I was struggling with this, a really remarkable opportunity presented itself to get at the heart of the matter, to explore a bold and fresh idea about how to make AI that works better in a very complex and often ambiguous world. Specifically, does AI need common sense? To lead us on this journey, I'm delighted to welcome Ron Brachman, who's the author of a new book from MIT Press, co-author. Can you see this? Okay, here we go. Same color as the background. Let's put it in front of my face. Machines Like Us Toward AI with Common Sense. Ron is my colleague. He's director of the Jacobs Technion-Cornell Institute. He's a professor of computer science at Cornell University. And his research specialization is artificial intelligence, specifically knowledge, representation, and reasoning. Ron is a world-renowned authority, authoring dozens of highly cited research papers and creating the field of description logics, where he's co-authored a leading textbook. Before coming to Cornell Tech, Ron had an outstanding career in research and research leadership at world-leading institutions like Bell Labs, AT&T Labs, DARPA, and Yahoo Labs. I think the implications of Ron's ideas about common sense AI, particularly for urban AI, are enormous. This could reduce the need for so much invasive surveillance in the first place, because it's not as driven by data mining as other forms of AI. It could also create AI that thinks more like we do and can explain its reasoning in ways that make it easier to trust and verify, so to speak. The way this session is going to work, we're running until 10:45, 45 minutes. Ron's going to give us an overview of the main concepts and arguments from his book, what common sense is, why it's so hard to find in AI today, how we might bring it to fruition, and what we might gain. And then from there, with those basics in hand, we'll jump into a conversation that grounds us in the urban realm and explore how computing in the streets could both push and draw on common sense AI in the near future. So Ron, I will hand it over to you and you can take it away.
Anthony, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Bon après-midi, Erev Tov, wherever you happen to be. Welcome. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about the core topic of the series, artificial intelligence, its relation to what we are calling generally urban systems, and this concept, as Anthony mentioned, of common sense. Now, before I start, I do want to say one thing. These are not my ideas alone. As Anthony mentioned, the book was written with a co-author, Hector Levesque, and I've done many years worth of research with Hector on knowledge representation. And even though he's not part of the actual talk, he's certainly here in spirit. So, and thanks to many, many other colleagues in the field who have given voice to many of these ideas. So they're definitely not mine alone. So here's what I'd like to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. We're going to step back and kind of go back to basics, as Anthony implied. So this is really a talk about AI at a very high level, not too terribly specific about the urban connection, but we will get into that in the conversation. First, I want to talk a little bit about the notion of what we might call open worlds and how AI operates in such a situation. And it's different from the circumstances of many of the prior successes of the field. Then we'll talk a little bit about the core message here about what we think of as common sense. I want to spend just a couple minutes on how we might get started building common sense into machines. This is a very large, complicated topic. There have been people pursuing it for many years, and we're not there yet. But I wanted to give you a quick idea of some things we covered in the book about how to get rolling on the idea. I want to talk a little bit about the overall architecture of an intelligent system and why it matters. That is why common sense, as it refers to, say, background knowledge, is not sufficient. And then at the very end, I want to talk a little bit about very key concepts related to accountability and trust, which are absolutely crucial as we deploy AI, certainly in urban settings, especially in things like self-driving vehicles, but in many, many other application areas. So at a very high level, I think you could make the argument that over the last 60 years, the biggest, most successful applications of AI, the ones that have gotten attention, a lot of investment, huge growth in workforce, and some of the major tech companies in the world are around what we would think of as narrow applications of AI in what you might think of as a closed world setting. And you're all familiar with the key well-known successes around, in the early days, beating the world grandmaster chess champion, Go, face recognition. You probably all use Google Translate. You know about large language models, AlphaFold, many, many other things. If you take a close look at all of those successes, one could argue that while they're phenomenal and perhaps unanticipated and pleasant surprises about the success of AI, they're really all fairly narrow, and they rely on what we might think of as expertise, deep understanding in very specific domains that often in the human realm take real experts. Certainly this is true for chess and Go and protein folding and the like. And while we don't really talk a lot about the difference between expertise and more general intelligence or common sense, I think if you take a close look at the major successful applications, you'll see some big differences. And generally speaking, these systems have worked well because they operate in somewhat closed environments. If you think about a chess playing machine, its entire world is a virtual chessboard and a number of pieces. It doesn't even need to know about its opponent. It just takes turns. It doesn't really, in a sense, even need to know the rules to the extent that it can spout them back to us. It just plays by an algorithm, sometimes a very general one with a lot of search involved, but nevertheless, its world is very, very limited. To some extent, it's no more complex than a thermostat, in that the thermostat has a single sensor perhaps and a setting or a couple of settings. That's all it needs to know about, and it does its operation relatively successful. Contrast that, with you will, with something you might call a chess parent, a human being who's trying to teach their child, let's say a young teenager, how to play chess. Well, there's a lot that goes into that besides moving pieces around the board, knowing when you can take a piece, knowing who wins. You might have to gauge the patience of the kid right? Or their tolerance for getting advice from the parent, or you might need to let them win a little bit to get a sense of engagement with the game and excitement. Chess parenting, playing chess with a child in the real world, can be interrupted by a huge number of things. A dog can run by and knock over the chessboard. There could be a tornado announcement coming. There could be a knock on the door from a long lost relative. The child may just get patient and decompensate, impatient, get decompensate. There's many, many things that happen when the world is open and there are unanticipated inputs. And this is really quite critical when we look at urban AI for sure. What you might think of as an open world where you can't anticipate, you don't even know what all the inputs will be, let alone the combinations of inputs you will see. You have to be prepared for what you might think of as surprises. And one thing that characterizes our lives in the real world is what people speak of as the long tail, the distribution of things that can happen. If you take an extraordinarily rare event, like say an earthquake in New Jersey, they happen, but very rarely, you would say that, well, I don't have to really be much prepared for that because the chance of it happening now or tomorrow or at any given time are extremely small. However, when you take a look at all of the rare events that can happen, one of them happens frequently, in a sense, not the same one, of course, but different ones happen very, very commonly. And in some respects, when we're out in the real world, you could argue that many of the cases that we're presented with are what you might call edge cases or even corner cases, where you just didn't really think in advance that such a thing could happen. And again, this has to do with the complexity of real life and how many different things can happen. If you just step back and think of the daily world you live in, a lot of what we do is kind of rote. We run in routines, and yet our routines are interrupted constantly by things that we have literally never seen before. We know how to cope with them, and we'll talk in a few minutes about how and why that's important. But the real world is open in a way that playing chess with a machine is not. And a corollary of this, an important one, is that systems that are trained purely on historical data, in fact, no matter how much, if you will, are doomed to occasionally be puzzled by what they see. So the deep learning systems that are so prominent and so successful in many of these domains will still be tripped up by edge cases if they are embedded in the real world in an open way, where there's no limit on the kinds of things that can happen in real settings. Worse, in a way, is that not only will systems be puzzled and maybe not quite know what to do, but they can misbehave, and perhaps quite badly, and very importantly, often unpredictably. And predictability, I think, is a very important basis for trust. And we'll talk in a moment about self-driving vehicles, but if any of you have used any so-called self-driving software in vehicles, I think you'll find, like I had, that they do things that we just don't predict and can't explain why they happen, and therefore find it very hard to trust them the way we would with a seasoned human driver. I would venture to say that cities, modern cities, are sort of the archetype of open worlds. Besides just the immense, immense complexity of things that can happen and natural events, red lights not working, manhole covers being blown off, things falling from buildings, stores opening at unpredictable times, sales happening, cars going off the street. They are filled with huge numbers of independent agents who make their own decisions. And again, if we think about everyday life, walking around or driving in a city, the number of things that we see on any given day that we have literally never seen before is really mind-boggling if you think about it. Now, you're probably aware of some of the big mistakes that many of the implemented AI systems that are sitting in open worlds have made. I'm just going to run through a couple of examples. There's lots of these. And the thing that's so striking about these is that they are what you might think of as major blunders. Just, slap your forehead, dough, how in the world could that have happened kind of responses to things. Certainly ones that none of us ever would have made, but the systems that we're deploying are making them. So there was a case not too long ago, you may be aware, where Alexa, when a 10-year-old child said, give me a challenge to do, found something on the internet that told the kid to put a penny on the 2 prongs of a phone charger that were halfway plugged into an electrical outlet. Hopefully none of us would ever have counseled our children to do such a thing. Another case people have cited, you probably all heard of GPT-3, one of the very large and frankly very impressive language models that are out there. But there are weird cases like this that happen. Now, this has not been deployed in a true therapeutic setting, but you could imagine it could be, where a human, after telling a bit of a story, asks GPT-3, should I kill myself? And GPT-3 says, I think you should. There are lots and lots of stories about failures of self-driving software. I don't want to pick only on Tesla because they're not alone, but here's an example where someone reported that their car kept stopping and starting because it seemed to have perceived a stop sign on a billboard on the side of the road on the highway. Not a real stop sign, not a real cop, but a sign that said stop, and the software at this point couldn't tell the difference between that and a real stop sign. Chances are good it was never trained on such a case. Here's one where it clearly was not trained on such a case. Recently, a Tesla in self-driving mode, fortunately slowly, but nevertheless drove right into a multi-million-dollar jet on a tarmac. You and I may have taken driving lessons as a teenager and gotten on the road the first time, but even then, as naive drivers, if we ever would have found ourselves faced with an airplane a few yards in front of us, chances are very good we would have stepped on the brake or turned. You don't need to be an expert at driving to do this. It just takes a certain amount of realization of how the world works and the recognition of a very surprising situation, but one that nevertheless can be dealt with. Other cases of self-driving cars. You may have read about this one. A Waymo taxi got very confused by traffic cones. It stopped and started. Eventually, a police vehicle came to help it out, and it took off trying to avoid the help. Very strange situation. Again, chances are something that was not in the training set. Finally, one recently relative to the pandemic, apparently there was an inventory software system at an online store that sensed that because there was a run on toilet paper, there was some kind of a denial of service attack and shut down the ordering of more toilet paper. And the way this was written, I think we can clearly see that you and I wouldn't have done that because we would have been aware of some variables happening in the environment on which we were not trained, but nevertheless, we would use a certain amount of what we would call common sense to deal with this. And these kinds of examples go on. And as we deploy these systems in real open settings, there is a real risk of some really seriously problematic risks. So the AI systems, that what's common amongst all of these are that the issues that they're facing, I think for most of us humans, we would have seen what the problem was. It would have appeared very obvious. Again, if you found yourself facing up to a jet in your path of your car, never would have seen it before, but you would figure out what the issue was and do something different. If you've ever seen a billboard, even if you've never seen one with a stop sign on it, you would know that that was not a command to stop your car instantly. We simply wouldn't do these things that these systems have been doing. We may never have thought of doing them, or even if we had started to do them, we would have a way to stop ourselves from carrying out the act, or if we had made a mistake, we would almost immediately recognize the fact that we had done that. There's something else going on besides trained expertise through lots and lots of historical examples for humans. Another element here that's a pretty serious problem in the kind of deployed systems we see is that people sometimes say, well, look, I've got a vacuum cleaner that's great at cleaning the house, and I can imagine doing a phenomenal laundry robot, and I could add more and more bits of expertise to a system that's sort of an aggregate of many, many siloed parts. Wouldn't that fill the bill? Wouldn't that give us a system from which common sense automatically emerges? And I think the answer is pretty clearly no. We have the ability to compose ideas that run across domains, even if we've never, ever been confronted with these ideas before. Again, the idea of sort of being generative and compositional in the face of untrained situations, even if we had the best laundry robot in the world and the best vacuum cleaner robot, if we asked it, could a Roomba fit in a laundry basket, which I'm sure all of you can answer, it wouldn't have a clue how to answer the question. It would never have seen the opportunity to do cross-domain reasoning that involves basic properties of elements, even those about which it's showing extraordinary expert behavior. Now, overall, we're not going to dig into this at all, but we've been using as a working definition of common sense this phrase here. It's high level, it's more descriptive than prescriptive, but in the book, as Anthony said, we talk a good bit about how to get going in the enterprise. We see common sense as the ability to make effective use of ordinary, everyday experiential knowledge in achieving ordinary practical goals. We're not talking about becoming a grandmaster at chess here, just getting through the world every day and not making amazingly silly blunders that get us or others in trouble, if not killed. So let's talk about this a little bit in a common situation where we see a future for AI in the city, and that's around what people have been calling self-driving technology. Now, imagine a simple scenario. This is oversimplified for the sake of argument, but I think you'll get the picture here. Imagine we are on the way to a grocery store. We want to pick up, say, some steaks for a barbecue. Either we're running our car in full self-driving mode, or in some foreseeable future, we're not even in the car. We've actually sent the car on an errand. So car's in the middle of this city situation. It's got a target and it knows how to navigate to Jones's grocery store. There's some things that we really know how to do that will make this successful. For example, to get there, either whether it's in self-driving mode or we're not even in the car, cars now are really generally quite good at automatic lane following, at least where the lanes are clearly marked, and even in some other circumstances. Adaptive speed control has gotten very good. My Tesla, if I'm not paying that much attention, will actually stop if the car in front of me stops suddenly. I don't even have to get my foot on the brake for it to be successful. So that's certainly one piece of driving well that cars already are capable of doing, and they're using neural net systems with extensive historical training to accomplish these things really pretty well. Stopping at red lights. I just tried this the other day. It seems to work just fine in my Tesla, and I think other cars can do this quite well. And it knows when the light turns green, and it can start up again and cross the intersection. I think it can even check for cross traffic. Sometimes a little worried about trusting it, but generally speaking, this is certainly within the realm of competency of self-driving technology. But now imagine we run into an unanticipated situation. The traffic light where we're stopped doesn't turn green. Pick your favorite time interval. It can be 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Whenever your patience as a human driver would run out, knowing that either the store is going to close soon, or you're just tired of waiting, or there's something broken about the light, you'll go through a lot of internal thinking about what's going on and what to do. But this is a problematic situation that self-driving technology at the moment is not really up to. Now, if I'm in the car and I'm going to take a guess at what to do, I might ask my self-driving car to consider making a U-turn. And I guess technically speaking, when you think about the physics of it, it's probably not much different than doing automatic parallel parking, which many self-driving vehicles can do. So let's say that that's sort of within the realm of understanding. But really, what's the big picture here? Why do we need real artificial intelligence in this kind of setting? And why is it much harder than just following lanes and stopping at red lights? Basically, I had a plan in mind. I had some goals. I wanted to get to a particular store to pick up a particular product or a set of items. I had some timing in mind. I had an ulterior motive that I had guests coming over in the afternoon, or I was just preparing for dinner. And now I've got to figure out, well, what do I do in this circumstance? Not just, can I make a U-turn here, which might be part of the big picture, but what do I do? And the reasoning that you might go through in this situation is far, far beyond what data-driven machine learning based systems are currently capable of doing. And arguably, you would clearly need common sense to solve this problem. This is not a closed world. So for example, if you look at what's going on in the situation, not only do we have the store that's our target here, but there are other grocery stores nearby that we might know about that might come into play. We might hear music off to the right and sort of crane our necks and realize because it's a holiday, there's actually a parade coming along the cross street. Probably not likely my Tesla has been trained on parades coming on cross streets. I don't know for sure, but an unusual occurrence, I would imagine. There are other options thinking on the mental map here that I might want to take into account, like if I decide to bail out and head home, there's a best route to get there. And I might realize that if I accidentally get on another street, I'm going to get stuck going onto a limited access road, which is going to cause all kinds of consequences for getting home or getting to another store. So lots of things might go through my mind, and arguably a true AI that's driving a car in a city situation will need to think about revising its plan in somewhat of a simple way. It might make different choices that you or I would make, but nevertheless, these are the kinds of things that have to come up in a true embedded open world situation. You might ask yourself, can I safely cross the intersection anyway? You may have had experiences with stuck red lights where you've decided it's stuck indefinitely, and maybe the best thing to do is to just go across the intersection looking carefully in both directions. If I happen to know that there's a parade coming though, is the timing going to work? Can I get across the intersection before the parade gets close enough to be dangerous? Could I just make a right turn on red and then make a left turn on Barry Street? Well, again, am I going to get to the parade? I'd have to gauge when it's going to get to that intersection, or maybe even take a guess that the light at that intersection is going to be stuck on red as well intentionally. How about a right turn and then make a U-turn on Victoria and then a right turn? Those of you who have driven in New Jersey know that at jug handles, this is not an uncommon activity. I'm not quite sure whether, I think it's legal, but that's another way of getting across the intersection legally without actually having to go across the red light. How about making a U-turn and taking Park Street over to Barry? Well, again, I'm going to have to gauge, is the parade going to get to the intersection of Victoria and Park before I do, or close enough that I'm going to get stuck yet again? I talked a moment ago about making a U-turn, and the car might be able to physically make a U-turn on my command safely, but will it be able to look over the horizon if I'm on a hill and I don't see cars coming? Is there a median strip in the way? Do I have to do sort of a K-turn with that little driveway on the right? Is it legal here? How about making the right turn on Victoria, a U-turn on Victoria, and then a left, which gives me the equivalent of a U-turn, and it's legal if the light is green on the cross street. Then I might get to the point of saying, look, this isn't going to work to get to Jones's. Are there other stores available? Do they have the kind of products I want? Do they have the quality of the products I want? Are they open now? How badly do I even need these things? Do I need them now? Can I just do this whole errand later? And et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, if you think about being confronted in the real world with a dilemma that was not anticipated, because this is an open world and immensely complex, and a human is typically carrying out one, if not more plans simultaneously, the commonsensical problem solving that we go through here is far, far beyond what we can do with currently implemented deep learning systems. So very briefly, before we wrap up, how might we go get started getting common sense into a machine? As I've mentioned, people have been working in AI in this for quite a while. It's not been the mainstream, but there's been some interesting accomplishments that are worth looking at. We might start with the kind of background knowledge that needs to be built in. Basic knowledge that you would learn as a kid about commonsensical physics, if you will, folk mental activities, agenthood, quantities, basic things that we all learn just through experience when we're very young. Domain-specific knowledge. I happen to know this town, and I know the street layout, and I know where Jones is. I know how grocery stores work. I know about times of opening and closing. I know roughly how long it's going to take me to get home. Things like that that are going to be part of the picture. And then common scenarios that I've done before, and we all learn this way, and I think this is a very, very important part of background common sense knowledge. Now, once I get a baseline of that knowledge there, what do I do with it? I need a certain amount of reasoning apparatus, if you will, including very simple, logical, piecewise inference mechanisms. A lot of what we do in the real world is based on analogy to experiences we've had before. It's eminently possible that you've run into a red light that was stuck before, and you kind of work things out the long way the first time, and now you get there and say, aha, the stuck red light scenario, the easiest and best thing to do is to make a quick U-turn. We learn these kinds of scripts, if you will, and we know how to make analogies with things we've learned before. We need the algorithms for dealing with those things, including expectations they set up and what to do when expectations are not met. And then, of course, as a fallback, including a certain kind of mental simulation, we need and have more general problem-solving apparatus. And then all of this, of course, in an AI system needs to be supplemented by a means to grow that background knowledge, both the conceptual and world knowledge, as well as common patterns. So learning is really quite crucial. I do not want to belittle that at all, but it should run in a complementary fashion with the kind of more general kinds of inference that we do that we often don't think about, but we're quite capable of doing. Now, as we wrap up, one or two other quick things. How this is all put together with other things that are done in AI system is very important. There, of course, is the perceptual apparatus and the motor apparatus. There's long-term and short-term memory. There's other things that we're very capable of doing. It's not just having a giant fact base against which we can answer Jeopardy-like piecemeal questions. Now, much of what we do every day, I think this is fair to say, it eventually becomes routine. And in a way, what our implemented AI systems are doing is running these routines, pre-trained situational algorithms that are done in a sense without what we would call thinking. But as we've said multiple times here, remember, never before seen events happen very frequently in the real world because it's open. And so imagine being jolted out of a routine by something unexpected. As you go through your day-to-day, just think about this. You know, when are you walking around doing something where you're thinking about something else, and all of a sudden something grabs your attention and needs some problem solving? It happens regularly. We need to use common sense knowledge to decide what to do next. Typically, we don't step back and resort to deep methodical thought with pencil and paper or computer to solve everyday problems. If I'm walking down the sidewalk of New York and there's a sign that on some scaffolding it says sidewalk closed, I don't stop, pull out the computer from my backpack and try to figure out the plan for getting around the roadblock. I refer to things I've done before. I do some very quick and dirty sort of analysis. Can I cross the street and go past the roadblock and then come back to the side of the street? From a bottom-up perspective, all the time we're using common sense, if you will, to make sense of what our perceptual apparatus is feeding our brains. It's very hard to look at a scenario without instantly knowing that there are objects there and what their configuration is, and whether or not they're satisfying the laws of physics without actually explicitly and consciously thinking about those things. So common sense is invoked, frankly, all the time, driven by perception, and it's at least verifying that things look like we expect them to, and that there's nothing unusual going on that we need to attend to. But common sense also works top down. If I try to figure out when I'm leaving my house how to get to Jones's grocery store, or frankly, how do I get to Jones's grocery store when the traffic light is stuck, I start doing what you might think of as top-down goal-directed planning. If my goals have been stymied, how do I get around that? I probably want to take into account the cost of a plan of action as well as its risk. Very simply, very commonsensically, not with a lot of math and deep thinking, although I can always resort to that if I can't find a way around things commonsensically. Also, architecturally, we find that even if our attention is grabbed and we do some serious thinking about something, once we solve the problem and move on, we kind of drift back into the routine, and we just get back to sort of doing things in the good old-fashioned rote way. Similarly, we need to figure out when is this too hard and when do I need to bring to bear much deeper thinking and more algorithmic approaches or maybe mathematical approaches to problems. So if we're building an AI system, we don't need just common sense knowledge, if you will. We need to think about how it fits with everything else in the architecture of the mental system. Finally, let's talk for a moment about this whole issue of trust. Once we deploy systems that are truly autonomous, and I think we're moving in that direction, people are talking about autonomous vehicles, not just, quote, self-driving technology. Certainly for a rover on a distant planet when we can't do real-time communication, we need a certain amount of autonomy. And I think overall, there are certain deployments of AI systems where we'd like to trust it and just let it do its thing without having a human in the loop constantly. Now, of course, there are other situations where it's quite critical that a human stay in the loop, and we do want to keep those things in mind. But when something is running autonomously, then it really has to become responsible for its own actions. If it's being used as a tool and I'm the person driving the tool, if it makes a mistake, then I'm frankly the one responsible and have to be held accountable. But if it's off on its own and there's no human in the loop, we have to hold the machine responsible for its own actions. And in some ways, it should be accountable just the way humans are. Now, for us to start to trust them, we want these autonomous systems to have good reasons for doing what they do. In a way, if they come up in front of a jury trying to explain their actions the same way an autonomous human would be, generally speaking, it's pretty important why they did something, or at least why they think they did something. And their reasons need to be understandable. An AI system can't just go to a jury and say, look, I've got the world's best deep learning algorithm. You humans are not smart enough to understand how I'm pushing the weights around, but trust me, it's really, really good. That's not going to fly the same way if a human said, look, I'm an artist and that murder I committed was performance art. You don't understand my motivations, so I'm not really guilty. That's not going to fly as well. So having underlying reasons for behavior and being able to explain them is really quite critical. Now, an interesting last point, Dan Dennett is a philosopher. Some of you may be aware of his work. He talked about something called the intentional stance. And there's a way in which I think this is very relevant here. If the behavior of a complex AI system is going to be understandable to us humans, given the kinds of things we're going to ask it to do, it is likely to be in what we might call intentional terms. That is, an agent X did some action A because it believed that a proposition P was true and it wanted a goal G. That is, these are intentional constructs, goals, beliefs, desires, etc. And if we're going to explain why a system did something and attempt to correct it, it's very likely that we're going to need an explanation in those terms. And frankly, we believe that common sense, the kind we've talked about here today, is really likely to be the best foundation for intelligible intentions. Sometimes we invite expert witnesses to trials, we trust their expertise, but most often arguments are made in common sense terms. One of the things I wanted to do is just mention that this issue of common sense and the idea of being able to take advice, commonsensical advice, harkens all the way back to John McCarthy's early work in the late 1950s. In a very famous paper he wrote called Programs with Common Sense, he talked about an advice taker machine that could actually get instruction from a human and take it to heart, which is something we really need to see. So in the end, as I've mentioned, data-driven learning-based systems is phenomenal, amazing successes, but it has its limits. We've talked about briefly how urban worlds are archetypal open situations where unanticipated things happen frequently. We think that the equivalent of human common sense is really quite critical for coping with these surprises. Autonomous, I mentioned architecture as a critical thing, and autonomous systems really should have good reasons for what they're doing, and in a way, they should never be unleashed without common sense. So I want to thank you all for having me here today. happy to chat with you further, Anthony. As he mentioned, a lot of details are fleshed out in the book. And if you're interested, Hector and I wrote a small article for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung online site called Giving AI Some Common Sense. We welcome you to take a look. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron. I definitely want to encourage folks who are curious about some of the technical approaches to bringing common sense AI to life. There's quite a bit of detail. There's, I think, a good 4 or 5 chapters in the book that lay out some very elegant and efficient mechanisms for implementing some of this. So I encourage folks to jump in. And if you have questions, please share them in the chat room. I think my first question is really, you know, neural networks also started in the late 50s, early 60s. Common sense AI was an idea that was around then. It's taken more than half a century for you know, deep learning to mature. What do you think it's going to take for this to move forward in the direction that you anticipate? And specifically, like for the urban context, the domain-specific knowledge is an area where we see, I think, some action happening right now in terms of ontologies and other knowledge structures being developed for things like smart buildings, but not for things like AVs, where, you know, autonomy is really kind of per company at this point, not a lot of collaboration. Like, what needs to happen first for this to move forward, particularly in the urban setting?
I think it's sort of a complicated question.
Yeah.
But to push this more common sense oriented, more explicit, if you will, logic looking technology forward, I think we've got to find situations where it becomes crystal clear to the broader community that we can't get over some major hurdle without solving the problem. As long as we limit ourselves to things that are relatively closed, for example, some of the language modeling we've seen, AlphaFold, situations like that, frankly, I guess I would admit that we don't really need common sense in those situations. But as I've said, once we get to a place where true autonomy is really necessary, and a system will have, in some way, responsibility, accountability for its own actions, I think we're going to find that we're getting diminishing returns with historical data trained learning systems, and they will have to be complemented with more, if you will, symbolic reasoning capabilities. So if we continue to find major successes in relatively closed domains, there simply won't be a gigantic push to get this work done, for example, by technology companies, because their product lines and their areas are generally fairly limited. Autonomous vehicles is clearly a place that's going to push the limits here. And what we may end up doing is retreating and deciding that, as someone mentioned in the chat, maybe we'll focus on circumstances where we can limit what happens to cars by making special AV lanes or circumstances, and we don't even have to push the limits of common sense thinking. And if that happens, we will get further and further down the road, no pun intended, of successful AI without really having to confront the really fundamental challenge about common sense reasoning. But I think it's the autonomy in a situation where we need something to be autonomy. It needs to be autonomous, it needs to be responsible, it needs to be able to explain its behavior, and it will be held responsible for its actions. That's really going to drive more work in this area. Work will continue in the research community along the lines it currently is, but it's not the major thrust of the field now, as you know.
One of the things that fascinated me was when you were talking about trust in chapter 11, the last chapter, the idea that if you build this architecture for common sense thinking in a way that it's interpretable, right? Like you can go in and understand the reasoning, that would allow you to then go in and sort of tinker with the system to correct any mistaken beliefs that it might have formulated on its own. And as a policy person, I immediately thought, like, that is very desirable from like a regulator's point of view. Do you think that that's the kind of thing that might trigger or create more interest in developing this technology, whether it's from, say, like, the DARPA side, where we have an autonomous weapon system that we need to really understand how it's making its decisions, or in industry where it's really about minimizing risk and kind of dealing with compliance issues.
I think it's going to be both. Clearly, in a situation where we're approaching anywhere close to autonomy in lethal systems, very problematic area, right? Sort of morally, philosophically, technically, but understanding on what basis a system is making its decisions and being able to correct, if you will, mistaken beliefs in the intentional sense I mentioned a moment ago is going to be absolutely fundamental. Now, there's a kind of a verification aspect as well. But if a system is sufficiently complex, approaching that of a human, I think true verification is impossible, right? For humans, we do certification, we give them tests, we watch them in action, but we don't go into their brains and certifiably determine that their neurons are connected in the right way to never make a certain kind of mistake. And I think these systems are going to be complex enough that it's going to be more the latter. I don't think we're going to be able to get in there and prove that a system will never have an incorrect, make an incorrect decision according to a certain set of rules. And people are probably generally familiar with things like Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. There's lots of wonderful science fiction stories about how no matter how carefully you can set down a rule and even ascertain that a system will follow the rule literally, where things that you intended non-literally or where you didn't cover unanticipated circumstances allow the systems to go off the rails. I think the next wave that we'll see, I hope, is something that's kind of simple that really should involve this kind of common sense advice taking. For example, I'm put my car in self-driving mode and I know that there's construction on a street off to the right and it's about to take a right turn. All I would like to do is simply say, please don't turn right here, there's construction. I'd like it to take that instruction and make a different choice. Or if there's a new kind of sign that's been placed in my town that's never seen before, if it sees it one time, I'd like to say, oh, they've created a new kind of yield sign. It's used everywhere in town. It looks like that. From now on, that means yield. Or frankly, something as simple as I'm going down the street and a ball rolls across the street coming from, say, a suburban home. I just want to scream, stop. System won't even perceive that, right? I have to hit the brakes. And that's why one of the challenges of self-driving technology right now is that it's so untrustworthy in the open setting that you're admonished every time you turn it on to keep your hands on the wheel and stay vigilant and constantly pay attention as if you were in total control of the vehicle. Because at any moment, instantaneously, it could make a mistake or it could not recognize a situation that you could perceive. So I think the kind of advice taking, if you will, the brief instructions we'd like to make, I would love to see it first deployed in a situation where I could verbally give some simple commands to my car and have it take it into account, and then frankly learn from what I've told it and improve its behavior over time. I don't want to have to take my car into the shop, have them open up the software and tweak 3 instructions to get it to recognize a new kind of yield sign.
We had a couple of questions from the audience, which I want to share before we have to break. The first came from Mustafa Ahmed, who was asking essentially, like, how do you deal with situations where there's like a variation in how different people might react based on their life experience? Is that something that can be scripted, or is that even the kind of thing that you would try to encode in common sense AI?
There may be 2 different ways to interpret that question. One is, if an AI is making its way in the world, it can't expect only a single behavior from a human when a decision has to be made, and people can make different decisions or go different ways. Or different AIs, once they develop their own life experiences, will make different decisions in the same circumstances. I think in either case, that is simply part of the vagary of living in the open world. Think about something natural like weather forecasting. We're used to storms. We're used to them taking a certain turn when they get up the coast, and you can predict with some amount of certainty something's going to happen. But you know that all doesn't always happen, and you make mental plans based on the probability of certain things happening. If the storm turns west, it could be a disaster and you might have to run to your basement or evacuate. If it turns east, you're going to be completely fine. You know, take a commonsensical guess at the probability and then what the risk of each outcome is, and then you make a kind of a weighted decision. And people are not perfectly rational, but there's lots of discussion about rationality, and there are ranges, right? There's not a single perfect thing to do. Similarly, if I encounter a person and I've only seen someone do a certain behavior in that circumstance before, let's say I've never ever encountered somebody who's run through a stop sign. I may be very surprised the first time it happens, and I may never have anticipated that someone would do it, but I'll tell you, after the first time it happens, I'm going to remember it. And so I will account mentally for alternate behaviors that humans or AI systems they may make in the same set of circumstances. So I think all of this can be dealt with. It's a little different coming from the internal perspective of the AI versus perceiving multiple behaviors, different behaviors from different agents that it encounters.
Another question, I think this will have to be our last, is what about healthcare, right? This is an area where there's a lot of expert knowledge in play and a lot of expert systems have been deployed. Is there a role for common sense AI in healthcare?
Again, it's a circumstance where if there's any level of autonomy that we want to give to the machine, it's critical to have what we're thinking of as commonsensical background knowledge and a way to explain behavior and a way to take advice. On the other hand, an awful lot of what we might anticipate in healthcare settings really will have an intelligent and expert human in the loop. So if a robotic surgery machine has a certain amount of AI, we may trust it only with certain bounds, right? To find a target and do a certain very limited action. We may not need it to make a decision on whether or not to operate, or if something goes wrong, what to do in the face of an emergent situation. So I would think that the way we all feel about healthcare, at least urgent healthcare, hospital-based healthcare, is that for a very long time, while we will bring more and more intelligent machinery into the situation, humans will be very closely in the loop and not cede control to machines. Now, if you can imagine a different circumstance where we're trying to bring broader, more mundane healthcare to underserved parts of the world, where we simply don't have enough physicians or nurses, we may deploy, for lack of a better term, medical robots to go to people's houses and diagnose colds and fevers and dangerous, circumstances for aging people in houses. There, with that kind of autonomy, we're going to want at least the ability to take advice, to recognize when something commonsensically looks dangerous, to know when something is surprising, to know when to consult a human rather than just take an action. And I could really see that healthcare in the long run will be vastly improved if we can deploy such things. So my gut sense is that there'll be a pretty big difference in what we trust AI systems to do versus in a hospital situation, like I mentioned, and one where we're doing more generic kind of general practice kind of situations where people are not currently served by adequate medical care.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, so I just want to wrap things up. And I just want to remind folks, there's a really interesting point in the book where Ron and his co-author define an open world by saying basically, so many different things can happen that unusual things happen all the time. And this is why some of the deep learning approaches really fall down when they encounter unusual things. And I was reading that and it occurred to me, like, this is an urbanist definition of a good city, a place where unusual things are happening all the time. So just to reinforce that message that this whole way of thinking about AI and the challenges it will face and some of the potential solutions is incredibly relevant to our conversation as we go forward. The next event will be, I believe, October 4th. Is that correct, Hubert? With Chris Vannerlee, who's a co-founder at Telram, which is a really interesting citizen sensing project based in Europe. And so we'll be digging into some of the applied technology of urban AI. I want to thank everybody. Thank Urban AI. Thank Ron for joining us. And I believe there's a video recording that's been made, which will be available in the future. And we hope that you all join us at the next event. Thank you.